Introduction.
Welcome to The Spirits Within, a thrilling horror audiobook written by Lewis Critchley. Set in the tranquil setting of Sunnyvale Animal Sanctuary, this tale follows the journey of Emma, a compassionate animal lover, as she uncovers dark secrets lurking beneath the surface of her seemingly idyllic workplace. Chapter 1. Most people don't believe animals have souls, but if you look into their eyes, really look, you'll see a depth there, of feeling, of knowing. There's more going on behind those eyes than most folks realize. That's what was on my mind as I watched the sun crest the hills, sending shards of light through the old oak branches and across the dew-damp grass. The roosters were hollering their fool heads off, and the cows were lowing, soft and low, like they were humming some bovine hymn. It was a fine morning to be alive. I hoisted my pail of kitchen scraps and veggie peelings and headed out to the barn. As I crossed the yard, I could see my breath puffing out in plumes, the ground crunching under my boots. Yep, Old Man Winter was tightening his grip. When I slid open the barn door, the sheep jostled each other, their bleats ringing out in a ragged chorus. Such a ruckus. You'd think they'd never been fed before. I set down the slop pail and grabbed a hay bale, tossing flakes into the troughs. They fell on it like they'd been lost in the desert for months, the silly things. My name's Emma, by the way. I know it's an old-fashioned name. Sounds like I should be running around in petticoats and a pinafore. But my mama always said us old souls need old names. This place is Sunnyvale Farm Animal Sanctuary. It's not just a mouthful to say, it's a refuge, a safe haven for creatures that have known precious little kindness in their lives. We take in all manner of farm animals that have been abused, neglected, or just plain unwanted. Horses gone lame from overwork, hens past their prime laying years, baby bulls too scrawny for the veal crate. They all have a home here. Sure, it's not glamorous work. I'm up at the crack of dawn every day, mucking stalls and filling feed troughs no matter how my joints might creak. The work is hard, and the pay is peanuts. Well, we do have a few cheeky goats who'd happily take peanuts. But seeing these beautiful creatures heal, watching them learn to trust and even love again, there's nothing in the world more soul-satisfying. At least to my mind. I guess you could say I was born for this job. Even as a wee thing, I had a knack with animals. Not in a woo-woo, talk-to-the-animals kind of way. More of an intuition, an instinct for connecting with them. My mama used to say, I could make friends with a rock if I put my mind to it. After I'd fed and watered everybody, I wandered down to the pig pen to check on Harold. Harold's a big old lug of a pig, pushed out here by the farmer next door, who thought he wasn't gaining weight fast enough for market. Their loss is our gain, I say. Harold is just about the sweetest, smartest pig you could ever hope to meet. I leaned over the fence, peering into the pig house. Empty. Odd. Harold was usually front and center, ready for his morning scratch behind the ears. I grabbed a banana from my pocket, his favorite treat, and gave it a wiggle. Harold! I called in my best sing-songy voice. Oh, Harold! I've got a nana for you. Nothing. Not a snuffle nor an oink. A trickle of worry wormed its way down my spine. I told myself I was being silly, that he was probably just off wallowing in his mud puddle or rooting for acorns. Still, he'd never missed a banana before. I shook off the worry and made my way back to the house. Miles would be up and wanting his coffee. Miles is the man who started this whole sanctuary nearly 20 years ago now. He's getting on in years, but he's still as spry and stubborn as an old mesquite tree. He loves these animals with all his heart. I found him at the kitchen table, reading glasses perched on his nose as he frowned at the newspaper. Anything interesting? I asked, grabbing the coffee pot. He made a kind of grunting sound, which could have meant not really, or damn politicians, or... I wish you'd make the coffee stronger, little lady. I'd learned not to take it personal. Miles is a man of few words at the best of times. I sat down across from him, wrapping my hands around my mug, letting the warmth seep into my bones. There's nothing quite like that first hot sip on a cold morning. Didn't see Harold in his pen this morning, I mentioned, trying to sound casual. That got his attention. He set the paper down, eyeing me over the rims of his glasses. He wasn't in his house? I shook my head. Nope. I even shook a banana at him. You know how he comes running for bananas. Miles frowned, his bushy grey eyebrows scrunching together. Huh, that's not like him. Best go take another look after breakfast. I nodded, but that trickle of worry was beginning to feel more like a flood. See, pigs are creatures of habit. They like their routines. For Harold to miss his morning banana, to not be snoozing away in his house. Nonsense. I could feel it in my bones. We ate our toast and veggie patties mostly in silence, both of us chewing over our own thoughts. Miles's eyes kept flicking to the window, like he might catch a glimpse of Harold trotting by any moment. After we'd cleaned up, we bundled up and headed out to the pig pen. Jack, one of our volunteers, was already there, a banana in each hand, calling Harold's name. Anything? Miles asked. Jack shook his head. Not a snort. I checked all around the pen, even walked the perimeter fence. No sign of him. My heart sank right down into my tattered boots. This was bad. Real bad. You might not think losing a pig is such a big deal, but you have to understand, these animals are family to us. And Harold, he's special. He's been with us nearly 10 years, longer than any pig I've ever known. He's a survivor, a gentle giant with a heart as big as all outdoors. The thought of any harm coming to him, I couldn't even let my mind go there. We spread out and searched the whole property. The horse pastures, the chicken yard, even the big cattle barn. We looked in every nook and cranny a clever pig might hide. But there was no trace of him, not so much as a tuft of hair or a hoof print. It was like he'd vanished into thin air. By lunchtime, we were all wrung out with worry. I collapsed into a chair on the back porch, my mind conjuring up terrible scenarios. What if he'd gotten out somehow and was lost, alone and scared and hungry? What if some hunter had... No, I wouldn't even think it. Miles stood at the railing, squinting out across the fields like he might suddenly spot a portly pink pig gallivanting through the frost-kissed grass. I just don't understand it, he said, softly. That pig's never tried to get out before, never even seemed keen on the idea. I bit my lip, a terrible thought taking shape. You don't think, could someone have taken him? Miles's head snapped around, his eyes narrowing. Who'd want to steal a pig? And why? I spread my hands, helplessly. I don't know. But pigs don't just vanish into thin air, Miles. Something happened to him. He sighed heavily, his breath puffing out in a cloud. I reckon you're right. I don't like it one bit, but I reckon you're right. We sat in glum silence, the weight of Harold's absence sitting on us like a stone. Finally, I stood up, my joints popping in protest. I'm going to call around to the other sanctuaries, see if anyone's seen him or heard anything. Maybe he got out and wandered over to Reba's place, or the Jameson farm. Miles just nodded, his eyes still fixed on some distant point. You do that. I'm going to ask around town, see if anyone saw anything odd last night. Somebody's got to know something. Jack volunteered to make some flyers. Bless his heart. We'll find him, Emma, he said, giving my shoulder a quick squeeze. We'll bring him home. I wished I could believe him. But deep in my soul, I knew this was more than a lost pig. Something dark was at work here, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. All I knew was that I wouldn't rest, wouldn't stop searching, until Harold was back where he belonged. As the sun began to slip toward the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple, I stood at the edge of Harold's empty pen, my eyes stinging with unshed tears. Where are you, buddy? I whispered to the lengthening shadows. Give me a sign, a clue, anything. But the only answer was the lonesome whistle of the wind through the bare branches and the distant, mournful lowing of the cows. I didn't know it then, but that was the moment everything changed. The moment the dark threads of fate began to weave themselves around us all, tangling us up in a web we could never have imagined. Harold's disappearance was only the beginning. The first domino in a chain that would topple our safe, simple world and lead us into shadows we never knew existed. But in that moment, all I knew was the ache of losing a friend and the cold, seeping dread that settled into my bones. All I could do was send up a silent prayer to God or the universe or whatever watches over foolish humans and brave, beautiful pigs. "Keep him safe," I whispered to the dying light. "Wherever he is, whoever's got him, just keep him safe and help me bring him home." Then I turned my back on the empty pen and the gathering dark and walked toward the warm glow of the house, determined that this would not be the end of Harold's story. One way or another, I would find the truth. I would bring him home, even if it killed me. Chapter 2. The next morning dawned cold and clear, the weak winter sun doing little to melt the frost that rimed every blade of grass and coated the paddock fences. I stayed huddled under my quilt a few minutes longer than usual, trying to shake the remnants of uneasy dreams from my mind. I'd tossed and turned all night, my sleep populated by dark, twisting shapes and the echoes of porcine screams. Waking brought little relief. The knot of dread in my gut pulled tighter with every passing minute. I forced myself out of bed, wincing as my bare feet hit the cold floorboards. No rest for the wicked, as Mama used to say. The animals still needed tending, no matter how heavy my heart might be. I pulled on my thickest socks and warmest flannel, but I still shivered as I stepped out onto the back porch. My breath puffed out in great plumes, dissipating into the pale pink sky. It was going to be a harsh one today. As I crossed the yard to the barn, I couldn't help but glance over at the pig pen, hoping against hope that I'd see a familiar snout poking out of the house or a curly pink tail whipping around a corner. But it remained still and silent, a glaring reminder of the hole in our little world. I slid open the barn door and was immediately enveloped by the earthy, animal scent of hay and warm bodies. It usually comforted me, that smell. It meant all was well. Everyone was safe and accounted for. But this morning, it just emphasized the wrongness of Harold's absence. I went about the morning chores in a daze, my body moving on autopilot while my mind spun in endless, anxious circles. I nearly overfilled the water trough and scattered chicken feed all over my boots, earning some puzzled clucks from the hens. "Sorry, girls," I muttered, trying to brush off the mess. "I'm not quite myself today." I was just finishing up when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. I poked my head out of the barn to see Miles' old pickup rattling up the drive. He pulled to a stop and climbed out, his face set in grim lines. "Any news?" I asked, my heart in my throat. He shook his head. "Not a damn thing. I talked to everyone I could think of, the feed store, the post office, even that nosy old biddy at the general store. Nobody saw or heard anything odd." My shoulders slumped. I'd been clinging to the faint hope that someone, anyone, might have a lead, a clue, something to point us in the right direction. But it seemed Harold had simply vanished into the ether. Miles must have seen the despair on my face, because he reached out and patted my shoulder, a rare gesture of comfort from the taciturn old cowboy. "We'll find him, Em," he said gruffly. "One way or another, we'll bring him home." I nodded, not trusting my voice. We stood there for a moment, two lost souls adrift in a sea of uncertainty. The moment was broken by the bang of the screen door. Jack came trotting down the porch steps, a stack of flyers clutched in his hand. "Got the flyers printed up?" he said, waving them at us. I figured we could start posting them around town, maybe hit some of the farms further out too. I took the top flyer, Harold's gentle, whisker-red face, staring back at me. "Missing pig," the bold text proclaimed. "Answers to Harold. Friendly, reward offered for safe return." It all seemed so inadequate, so impersonal. Harold wasn't just some random livestock, interchangeable with any other pig. He was unique, irreplaceable. He was family. But I knew Jack was right. We had to do something, had to exhaust every avenue. I couldn't just sit around and wait for Harold to magically reappear. "Good thinking, Jack," I said, trying to inject some enthusiasm into my voice. "Let's get these posted up right away." We split up the flyers and the territory, Miles taking the north side of town, while Jack and I covered the south and the outlying farms. We spent the better part of the day tacking up flyers on telephone poles and bulletin boards, stopping in at every farmhouse and ranch we passed. Most folks were sympathetic, clucking their tongues and shaking their heads at the news of a missing pig. A few even promised to keep an eye out, to let us know if they spotted anything unusual. But as the day wore on, and the stack of flyers dwindled, so did my hope. It seemed we were no closer to finding Harold than when we'd started. As the sun began to sink towards the horizon, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange, Jack and I pulled up at the last farm on our route. It was a rundown old place, the paint peeling off the barn, and the fences sagging like old men's shoulders. A rusty sign at the end of the drive proclaimed it to be Gristle's Hog Farm. I frowned as we bumped up the rutted track. I'd heard of Gristle's before. Miles had mentioned them once or twice, always with a curl of distaste in his voice. From what I gathered, they were a factory farm operation, cramming hundreds of pigs into tiny, filthy pens and fattening them up for slaughter. The thought turned my stomach, but a missing pig was a missing pig, no matter where it might turn up. I steeled myself as we rolled to a stop in front of the dilapidated farmhouse. Jack cut the engine, and we climbed out, the flyers clutched in my sweaty hand. As we approached the sagging porch, the front door banged open, and a man stepped out, squinting at us suspiciously. He was a big man, with beefy arms and a gut that strained against his stained white t-shirt. His face was florid, and his eyes were small and mean, glinting out from under bushy brows. "What do you want?" he grunted, his gaze flicking from me to Jack and back again. I swallowed hard, trying to find my voice. Hi there. I'm Emma, and this is Jack. We're from the Sunnyvale Animal Sanctuary, just down the road a piece." The man just stared at me, his expression unchanged. I soldiered on. "We're looking for a missing pig," I said, holding up one of the flyers. "His name's Harold. He disappeared from our place yesterday, and we're just sick with worry. We thought maybe he might have wandered this way, or maybe someone might have seen him. We'd be so grateful for any information at all." I held out the flyer, but the man made no move to take it. He just kept staring at me with those beady, unfriendly eyes. "Ain't seen no pig," he said flatly, "and if I had, I wouldn't tell you. I don't hold with you animal rights types, sticking your noses in where they don't belong." I felt my hackles rise at his dismissive tone, but I tried to keep my voice calm and polite. "We're not trying to cause any trouble, sir. We just want to find our friend and bring him home safe." The man snorted. "Friend? It's a pig, girlie. Nothing more than bacon on the hoof. You're wasting your time looking for it. Probably turned into somebody's breakfast sausage by now." I recoiled as if he'd slapped me. The casual cruelty in his voice, the complete lack of empathy or concern. It was like a punch to the gut. Jack put a steadying hand on my arm, his face tight with anger. "Come on, Emma. This fella's not going to be any help. Let's get out of here." I let him lead me back to the truck, my legs feeling like rubber. As we climbed in, I couldn't resist one last glance back at the farmhouse. The man was still standing on the porch, his arms crossed over his chest, a smirk playing about his lips. He raised one hand in a mocking salute as we pulled away. We rode in silence for a few minutes. The only sound, the growl of the engine and the crunch of gravel under the tires. Finally, Jack spoke. "What a piece of work that guy was, huh? I've met some cold bastards in my time, but he takes the cake." I just nodded, not trusting my voice. The encounter had shaken me more than I cared to admit. It wasn't just the man's callousness, though that was bad enough. It was the gnawing fear that he might be right, that Harold was already gone, lost to us forever. Jack must have sensed my distress because he reached over and patted my knee. "Hey, don't let that asshole get to you. We're going to find Harold, okay? We're not giving up." I managed a wan smile. "I know. Thanks, Jack. I hate feeling so helpless, like there's nothing I can do." "I get it," he said. "But we're doing everything we can. And Harold's a tough old bird. He's out there somewhere, probably just waiting for us to come and get him." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that this was all just a bad dream, that any moment I'd wake up and find Harold snuffling at his trough, demanding his morning banana. But the sinking feeling in my gut told me it wasn't going to be that easy. We pulled up to the sanctuary just as the last light was fading from the sky. Miles was waiting for us on the porch, his face drawn and weary. "Anything?" he asked as we climbed out of the truck. I shook my head. We covered every inch of ground south of town, talked to every farmer and rancher we could find. Nobody's seen hide nor hair of him. Miles sighed heavily. "Same story up north. It's like he just vanished into thin air." We stood there for a moment, the weight of our failure hanging heavy in the air. Finally, Miles straightened his shoulders and fixed us with a determined look. "All right, enough moping. Pigs don't find themselves. Jack, I want you to get on the horn to the sheriff's office first thing in the morning, file an official report. Emma, you hit the internet, post about Harold on every lost pet site and animal rescue board you can find. I'll keep shaking the bushes around here, see if anything falls out. We're not licked yet, you hear?" Jack and I nodded, bolstered by his resolve. "Yes, sir," I said. "We'll bring him home, Miles, whatever it takes." He gave a curt nod. "Damn straight we will. Now let's get some shut-eye. Morning comes early around here." Sleep was a long time coming for me that night. I lay in my narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind whirring with dark possibilities. Where was Harold? Was he scared, hurt, hungry? Was he even still alive? The not knowing was the worst part, the terrible yawning void of uncertainty. When I finally did drift off, my dreams were fractured and strange. I was wandering through a dark wood, the trees pressing close around me, their branches clawing at my face and hair. I could hear Harold squealing in the distance, a high, terrified sound that made my blood run cold. I tried to run towards the sound, but my legs were mired in deep, sucking mud. The harder I struggled, the deeper I sank. Harold's screams grew louder, more desperate, until they filled my head, blotting out all other thought. I woke with a gasp, my heart pounding and my sheets tangled around my legs. Morning brought no relief from the sense of dread that had settled over the sanctuary. If anything, it seemed to have deepened overnight, seeping into every corner and crevice. The animals were restless and unsettled, the horses nickering nervously in their stalls, and the chickens huddling together in tight, anxious knots. Even the normally placid cows seemed on edge, tossing their heads and lowing mournfully as I filled their troughs. I tried to go about my chores as usual, but my mind was miles away, spinning endlessly around the black hole of Harold's absence. Every time I turned a corner, I half expected to see him trotting towards me, his curly tail wagging and his soft pink snout lifted in a grin. But there was only empty space where he should have been, a Harold-shaped hole in the fabric of our lives. As the morning wore on, with no word from the sheriff's office or any of our internet contacts, the knot in my stomach pulled tighter and tighter. By lunchtime, I was wound so tight I could barely choke down my sandwich. Miles and Jack weren't in much better shape, picking listlessly at their food and jumping at every creak of the floorboards. We were just clearing away the dishes when the phone rang, shattering the heavy silence. We all froze, staring at it like it was a coiled snake. On the fourth ring, Miles reached out and snatched it up. "Sunnyvale Sanctuary, Miles speaking." I couldn't hear the voice on the other end, but I could see the colour drain from Miles's face. He listened intently for a moment, his free hand gripping the edge of the counter so hard his knuckles turned white. "I see," he said at last, his voice carefully neutral. "No, we appreciate the call. Yeah, we'll be right there." He hung up the phone and turned to face us, his expression grim. "That was Sheriff Dunlap," he said. They found a pig's carcass out on Route 9, about 15 miles east of here. Says it looks to be about the right size and age to be Harold. The bottom dropped out of my stomach. I slumped back against the wall, my legs suddenly unable to support me. Beside me, Jack made a low, wounded noise. Miles held up a hand. Now, he said they can't be sure it's him without one of us coming down to identify the body. Could be just a wild hog got hit by a car, but he thought we'd want to know right away. I swallowed hard, fighting down the bile that rose in my throat. The thought of Harold lying dead in a ditch somewhere, alone and unclaimed. It was almost more than I could bear, but I knew we had to know for sure, one way or the other. We owed him that much. "I'll go," I said, my voice sounding thin and strangled to my own ears. Miles and Jack both started to protest, but I cut them off. No, it should be me. Harold. He was special to me. If it's him, I need to be the one to bring him home. Miles looked at me for a long moment, his eyes searching my face. Finally, he gave a slow nod. "All right," he said. "But you're not going alone? Jack, you drive her down there. I'll hold down the fort here, in case... well, in case..." Jack nodded, his jaw tight. "You got it, boss. Come on, Em. Let's get this over with." The drive to the sheriff's office passed in a blur. I stared out the window, watching the barren winter fields roll by without really seeing them. My mind was 15 miles east, in a lonely ditch on the side of the highway. What if it was Harold? The thought made my chest seize up, my breath coming in shallow gasps. How could I bear it, seeing his broken body, his clever eyes glazed and empty? He'd been through so much in his life, survived so many hardships. To have it end like this, discarded like roadkill, it was too cruel, too senseless. But even as my heart quailed at the possibility, some small shameful part of me almost hoped it was him. At least then we'd know. At least then there'd be an end to this terrible, grinding uncertainty. We could grieve and rage and begin to heal, instead of being stuck in this awful limbo, forever waiting for the axe to fall. We pulled up to the sheriff's station, a squat, unremarkable building on the edge of town. I saw Sheriff Dunlap waiting for us on the steps, his weathered face set in somber lines. He came down to meet us as we climbed out of the truck, his hand outstretched. "Miss Emma, Mr. Jack, I'm real sorry to have to call you down here under these circumstances." I shook his hand numbly, barely registering the rough warmth of his calloused palm. "Where is he?" I asked, my voice sounding distant and hollow to my own ears. Dunlap gestured towards a small outbuilding behind the station. "Got him laid out in the garage. Thought it'd be better for y'all to do this privately, instead of in the middle of the squad room." I nodded, swallowing hard against the lump in my throat. "Thank you, Sheriff. We appreciate that." He led us across the cracked asphalt of the parking lot, each step feeling heavier than the last. As we neared the outbuilding, I could smell the faint, cloying odor of decay wafting out to meet us. My gorge rose, and I had to fight down the urge to turn and run, to flee back to the sanctuary and bury my head under my pillow like a child hiding from the boogeyman. But I couldn't run, much as I wanted to. I owed it to Harold to see this through, to bear witness to his passing. He'd been a good friend, a gentle soul. The least I could do was offer him this last act of love and respect. Sheriff Dunlap pushed open the door, the hinges screaming in protest. Inside, the air was thick and still, heavy with the mingled scents of oil and rust and the unmistakable sweet-rot stench of death. In the center of the room, laid out on a wooden pallet, was a large, still form covered by a tarp. My breath caught in my throat, and I heard Jack make a low, pained sound beside me. Dunlap walked over to the pallet, his boots echoing loudly in the close confines of the garage. He took hold of one corner of the tarp and looked back at me, his eyes soft with sympathy. "You ready?" I wasn't. I would never be ready for this. But I nodded anyway, steeling myself for the horror I was about to face. Slowly, gently, the sheriff drew back the tarp, and there, lying in the harsh fluorescent light, was the body of a pig. For a moment, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. The animal on the pallet was large, easily 500 pounds, with coarse black bristles and a long, shovel-shaped snout. Its skin was a mottled, pinkish grey, marbled with dark splotches of blood. One of its hind legs was twisted at an unnatural angle, the white jut of bone poking through the torn flesh. But even through the gore and the damage, I could see it was not Harold. The shape of the snout, the set of the ears, the pattern of spots on its flank. It was all wrong. This was just some anonymous, unlucky wild pig, not our dear, sweet Harold. The wave of relief that crashed over me was so intense it made my knees buckle. I staggered a step and felt Jack's steadying hand on my elbow. "It's not him," I rasped out, my voice thick with unshed tears. "It's not Harold." Sheriff Dunlap let out a heavy breath and nodded, lowering the tarp back over the carcass. "Figured as much. Sorry to bring you all down here for nothing, but I thought you should know for sure." "No, we appreciate it, Sheriff," Jack said, his own voice rough with emotion. "Better to know than to wonder." We said our goodbyes and stumbled back out into the cool, clean air, gulping it down like we'd been suffocating. As we climbed back into the truck, I felt a strange mix of emotions swirling inside me. Relief, of course, that Harold was still out there somewhere, but also a renewed sense of urgency, a desperate need to find him before it was too late. We broke just about every speed limit on the way back to the sanctuary, Jack's knuckles white on the steering wheel. We barely spoke, both of us lost in our own dark thoughts. When we pulled up to the house, Miles came hurrying out to meet us, his face drawn and anxious. "Well," he demanded as we climbed out. "Was it him?" I shook my head. "No, thank God. Just some poor wild hog got hit on the highway." Miles closed his eyes briefly, his shoulders sagging with relief. "Good. That's good." But then he straightened up, his jaw tightening with renewed determination. "Right. So we keep looking. Jack, get back on the phone to the sheriff, the state police, any law enforcement agency that'll listen. Tell them we got a pignapping on our hands and we need all eyes on the lookout. Emma, you keep working those internet channels, but expand the search radius. Harold could be 50, 100 miles from here by now. And I'm going to hit the road, start knocking on doors, shaking trees, kicking over every rock till I find some answers. We are not giving up on him, you hear me? Not now, not ever. That pig, he's family. And we don't turn our backs on family in these parts." Jack and I nodded, our own resolve bolstered by Miles's fierce conviction. Aye, Captain." "Ura," I added, managing a small, tight smile. We dispersed to our various tasks, a renewed sense of purpose burning in our veins. I spent the rest of the day glued to the computer, posting Harold's photo and description on every forum and message board I could think of, from local community groups to national lost pet registries. I told his story, how he'd been rescued from an abusive situation, how he'd flourished under our care, becoming a beloved fixture at the sanctuary. I poured my heart out, pleading for any scrap of information, any hint of a sighting. Replies and well-wishes poured in from all over the world, from fellow rescue workers, animal lovers, and ordinary people touched by Harold's plight. But no solid leads emerged, no confirmed sightings or helpful tips. As the hours ticked by with no word from Miles or Jack, the fragile balloon of hope in my chest began to deflate. What if we were wrong? What if Harold wasn't out there somewhere, waiting for us to find him? What if the unthinkable had happened? And he was gone. I was just about to give in to despair when my phone buzzed with an incoming text. It was from Miles and contained just 2 words. "Got something." My heart leapt into my throat. I texted back immediately, my fingers shaking. "What is it? Did you find him?" The 3 typing dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. The seconds stretched like taffy as I waited for Miles's reply. Finally, it came through. "Not yet, but I might know where to look. Pack a bag and be ready to roll in 30. I stared at the screen, my pulse pounding in my ears. 1,000 questions bubbled up. Where were we going? What had he found? Was Harold okay? but I pushed them all aside. There would be time for answers later. Right now, there was only one thing to do. I flew into action, throwing clothes and toiletries into a duffel with shaking hands. I had no idea where we were headed or how long we'd be gone, but I packed for every eventuality. Warm clothes and sturdy boots, first aid supplies and emergency rations. And after a moment's hesitation, I reached under my bed and pulled out the small lockbox where I kept my grandfather's old service revolver. I didn't know what we were walking into, but I wanted to be prepared for anything. 28 minutes later, I was standing on the front porch, my duffel at my feet, watching the dust cloud that heralded Miles' approach. He came barreling up the drive in his ancient pickup, gravel spraying from beneath the bald tires. Before the truck had even shuddered to a full stop, I yanked open the passenger door and threw my bag inside, clambering up after it. "Where are we going?" I asked breathlessly, as Miles gunned the engine again, spinning us around in a tight arc. "Got a lead on a guy who might know something about Harold," he said grimly, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Fella named Tom Gristle, runs a hog farm a couple counties over." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Gristle? Not the same Gristle we talked to yesterday?" Miles nodded. "The very same. Did some digging after you and Jack got back from his place. Turns out old Tom's got a bit of a reputation in certain circles. Rumour has it he's not too picky about where he gets his pigs, if you catch my drift." My stomach turned over. The thought of Harold in the hands of that cruel, callous man was almost too much to bear. "You think he took Harold? But why?" "Could be any number of reasons," Miles said, his jaw tight. "Maybe he figured a well-cared-for pig like Harold would fetch a premium price at market. Maybe he just didn't like the look of us, wanted to take us down a peg. Or maybe he's running some kind of pig-fighting ring on the side, looking for fresh meat." Each possibility was more horrible than the last. I closed my eyes, fighting back the wave of nausea that rose in my throat. "We have to get him back, Miles. Whatever it takes." "Oh, we'll get him back, all right?" Miles growled. "And then we'll make damn sure Gristle never lays a hand on another animal again." We drove in grim silence after that, the only sound the growl of the engine and the whine of the tires on the asphalt. I stared out the window without really seeing the landscape blur by, my mind a million miles away. I thought about the first time I'd met Harold, how he'd come to us skin and bones, his hide crisscrossed with scars. He'd been skittish and mistrustful at first, flinching at every sudden movement, every raised voice, but with time, patience, and more love than I knew I had in me, he'd slowly come out of his shell. I'd watched in amazement as his personality emerged, playful and mischievous and whip-smart. He'd learned his name in a matter of days, coming running full tilt whenever I called, his curly tail wagging like a metronome. He'd become more than just another rescue, more than just a job. He was my friend, my confidant, the keeper of all my secrets and sorrows. The thought of losing him, of never again feeling his warm bulk lean against my leg, or hearing his contented snuffles as I scratched behind his ears. It was unthinkable. "We'll find him," I whispered, as much to myself as to Miles. "We have to." The sun was just starting to sink below the horizon when we crossed the county line, the sky streaked with bloody reds and bruised purples. Miles turned off the main highway onto a narrow, rutted track, the truck jouncing and shuddering over the uneven ground. After a few miles, a run-down farmstead came into view. The ramshackle outbuildings huddled around a sagging main house, like supplicants around a dying king. A hand-painted sign hung askew by the road, the lettering faded and peeling. "Gristle's Hog Farm," it read, and beneath that, "No trespassing." Miles pulled up 100 yards shy of the entrance and killed the engine. For a long moment we just sat there, staring at the dilapidated compound, each of us lost in our own dark imaginings. "What's the plan?" I asked at last, my voice sounding thin and reedy to my own ears. Miles chewed on his lip, his brow furrowed in thought. "Way I see it, we got two options. We can go in guns blazing, confront Gristle directly, and demand he hand over Harold. Or we can try and sneak in quiet-like, see if we can find where he's holding him, and get him out without anyone being the wiser." I considered this. The first option held a certain appeal. The thought of seeing the look on Gristle's face when we called him out for the low-life pig thief he was had a definite satisfaction to it, but it was also risky. Gristle struck me as the type of man who wouldn't hesitate to meet violence with violence. And if he'd gone to the trouble of stealing Harold in the first place, he wasn't likely to just hand him over because we asked nicely. No, the stealth approach seemed wiser. Get in, get Harold, get out. Minimal confrontation, minimal opportunity for things to go sideways. Let's do it quiet, I said, decisively. Sneak in, find where he's keeping Harold, and slip away before anyone's the wiser. We can always come back with reinforcements later to deal with Gristle properly. Miles nodded slowly. All right, quiet it is. Let's head in on foot from here, stick to the shadows. With any luck, most of the farmhands will have knocked off for the day. We slipped out of the truck and grabbed our gear. Miles, shouldering a coil of rope and a bolt cutter, me gripping the worn handle of my grandfather's revolver like a talisman. We picked our way through the undergrowth at the edge of the track, every snapped twig and rustled leaf sounding as loud as gunshots in the gathering dusk. As we neared the ramshackle cluster of buildings, my nose wrinkled at the overwhelming stench of pig manure and rotting food. Beneath that, though, was a sharper, more chemical smell, a scent that set my teeth on edge without knowing quite why. Miles held up a hand, bringing us to a halt at the corner of a long, low barn. He peeked around the edge, then jerked his head for me to follow. We crept along the side of the building, crouching low beneath the grimy windows. At the far end, Miles tested a small side door. To my surprise, it swung open easily, the hinges silent and well-oiled. He shot me a troubled look over his shoulder. A place like this, with its air of neglect and decay, shouldn't have anything in such good repair. It was a jarring incongruity, one that sent a fresh trickle of unease down my spine. But there was no turning back now. With a deep breath, I followed Miles into the gloom of the barn. Inside, the stench was overwhelming, a miasma of filth and fear that coated the back of my throat. I gagged, burying my nose in the crook of my elbow. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I could make out row after row of small, cramped pens, each one housing a pig. But these were unlike any pigs I'd ever seen before. They were enormous, for one thing, easily twice the size of any hog I'd encountered on the farms back home. And their proportions were all wrong, their bodies too long and sinuous, their legs too thick and muscular. They looked like some nightmarish cross between a pig and a reptile, a freak of nature never meant to exist. But it was their eyes that truly horrified me. They glowed a dull, baleful red in the gloom, devoid of any semblance of porcine intelligence or curiosity. There was something deeply wrong with these creatures. Something twisted and abominable. I turned to Miles, my mouth open to voice my shock and revulsion. But the words died on my lips as I caught sight of his face. He was staring at the pens, his expression a mask of horror and grief. "Oh God," he whispered hoarsely. "What has he done to them?" I followed his gaze and felt my gorge rise. There, huddled in one of the cramped, filthy pens, was a familiar pink snout, a pair of gentle brown eyes I would have known anywhere. It was Harold, but not the Harold I knew, not the joyful, boisterous creature who had captured my heart. This Harold was a shadow of his former self, his once plump figure emaciated, his hide hanging loose on his jutting bones. One of his legs was twisted at an unnatural angle, the flesh swollen and discoloured. And his eyes were dull and lifeless, the spark of mischief and intelligence snuffed out. A low, keening moan escaped my lips. I lurched forward, my hands outstretched, desperate to gather him into my arms, to whisper comfort and apology. But before I could take more than a step, a cold, hard voice rang out behind us. "Well, well, look what the cat dragged in." I spun around, my heart in my throat. There, silhouetted in the doorway, was the hulking figure of Tom Gristle, and he had a shotgun levelled directly at my chest. "Shoulda known you bleeding hearts wouldn't let it lie," he sneered, his lip curling. "Couldn't just mind your own business, could you? Had to come snooping around where you don't belong." Miles stepped forward, his hands raised placatingly. Now, Tom, let's just take it easy here. We don't want any trouble. We just came for what's ours. Gristle barked a harsh laugh. Yours? That pig ceased to be yours the second he set foot on my property. He's mine now, bought and paid for. I gaped at him, a swell of fury and disgust rising in my chest. Bought and paid for? I sputtered. You stole him, you monster! Snatched him right out of his home. Gristle's eyes narrowed. Stole him, did I? Funny, I don't recall you making a fuss when I took all those other pigs off your hands. The runts, the sickly ones, the mean old boars you couldn't handle. You were happy enough to let me take them then. Miles shook his head vehemently. Those pigs were surrendered to use, rescued from abuse and neglect. We found them good homes with people we trusted. We never would have given them to you if we'd known what you were doing to them. He gestured at the pens, at the grotesque, misshapen creatures within. What in God's name have you done to them, Tom? What kind of sick experiments are you running here? Gristle's face twisted into a snarl. Experiments? I'm a businessman, not a mad scientist. I'm just giving people what they want. A better pig. A stronger pig. A pig that can take whatever the world throws at it and keep on coming. He ran a proprietary eye over the pens, a perverse gleam of pride in his gaze. You think I'm a monster. I'm a visionary. I'm pushing the boundaries of what's possible, creating a whole new breed of super pig. And if a few eggs have to get broken in the process, well, that's just the price of progress. Bile rose in my throat. The casual cruelty, the complete lack of remorse in his voice. It was chilling. This wasn't a man who could be reasoned with, who could be made to see the error of his ways. This was a man who had long ago severed any tie to his own humanity. You're insane, I whispered, my voice shaking with revulsion. Completely, utterly insane. Gristle's face darkened. Insane? Am I? We'll see how insane I am when my pigs are dominating the market, when every farmer in the country is beating down my door for a piece of the action. He took a step forward, the shotgun never wavering from my chest. But you two won't be around to see that, I'm afraid. Can't have you running off to blab to the authorities, sticking your noses where they don't belong. No, I think it's time for you to join your precious Harold in the pen. Permanently. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. I saw Gristle's finger tighten on the trigger, saw Miles tense beside me, coiled to spring. I knew with sickening certainty that in a matter of seconds, one or both of us would be lying dead on the filthy barn floor. My hand drifted towards my pocket, towards the comforting weight of my grandfather's revolver. Could I draw it in time, get off a shot before Gristle blew me away? Even if I could, even if by some miracle my aim was true, it would still be too late for Miles. He was directly in the line of fire, a human shield, between me and the barrel of that shotgun. And then, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, everything changed. A blur of pink shot out from the pen beside me, moving faster than I would have believed possible. It slammed into Gristle with the force of a freight train, sending him staggering back, the shotgun flying from his hands. It was Harold. Harold, who had seemed so broken, so defeated just moments before, now stood over Gristle's prone form, his bulk heaving with exertion and rage. Gristle stared up at him in shock, his mouth working soundlessly. And in that moment, I saw something flicker in Harold's eyes, something I had never seen there before. Something ancient and implacable, a feral intelligence honed by generations of suffering and servitude. Harold opened his mouth, and a sound emerged, a sound no pig should have been able to make. It was a voice, low and guttural, thick with an accent I couldn't place. "No more," he growled, the words rumbling up from some deep, primal place. "No more cages. No more chains. No more masters." Gristle's eyes bulged in disbelief. What are you?" he gasped, scrabbling backwards on the filthy straw. Harold advanced, implacable as a force of nature. "We are the ones you broke," he snarled, The ones you tortured and twisted, bent to your will. You thought you could make us into monsters, but you forgot one thing. He lowered his head, his red eyes boring into Gristle's terrified face. We were already monsters. The monsters you made us. And with that, he lunged, his powerful jaws closing around Gristle's throat. The man's scream cut off abruptly, lost in a wet, tearing crunch. I stumbled back, my hand flying to my mouth, half expecting to feel the warm gush of blood. But there was nothing, just the hammering of my own pulse, the rasp of my breath in my ears. Harold turned to face us, his snout dripping crimson. For a long, terrible moment, I thought he meant to attack us next, to rend and tear until nothing was left. But then, miraculously, the feral light faded from his eyes. His stance softened, his head dropping in an unmistakable gesture of submission. "Emma!" he rasped, and there was a lifetime of exhaustion in that single word. "Miles, I'm sorry. I couldn't let him. I had to." Miles stepped forward, his hands out, palms up. "It's all right, son," he said softly. "You did what you had to do, what we should have done a long time ago." Harold shuddered, a full body tremor that shook him from snout to tail. "The others," he said urgently. "We have to free the others." I nodded, a steely resolve settling over me. "We will," I promised. "Every last one. Gristle's reign of terror ends tonight." And so, beneath the blood-spattered beams of that nightmarish barn, a strange alliance was forged. A girl, an old cowboy, and a genetically modified super pig, united by the bonds of love and loyalty that transcend species. Together we laid waste to Gristle's twisted empire. We smashed locks, tore down fences, and led a ragtag army of liberated pigs out into the moonlit fields. In the chaos, the full extent of Gristle's depravity became clear. Hidden rooms filled with gleaming surgical equipment, vats of bubbling chemicals, and stacks of meticulously annotated notebooks, a treasure trove of perverted science. We burned it all, watching the flames lick the night sky, a funeral pyre for the innocent lives lost, the ones we hadn't been able to save. And then, as dawn broke over the smouldering ruins, we led our weary band of survivors home, back to the rolling hills and lush pastures of Sunnyvale. In the days and weeks that followed, our sanctuary became a haven for a new kind of refugee. The twisted creations of Gristle's experiments, no longer quite pig but not fully anything else, creatures caught between worlds. We gave them a home, a purpose, and most importantly, a family. Under the gentle guidance of Miles and myself, and the fierce protection of Harold, they began to heal, to rediscover the joy and curiosity that is the birthright of all living things. As for Harold, the change in him was nothing short of miraculous. Gone was the broken, defeated creature I had found huddled in that filthy pen. In his place stood a leader, a visionary, a champion for his kind. He wore his scars like a badge of honor, a testament to all he had endured and overcome. And when he spoke, in that strange, rasping voice that was his now, others listened. Under his guidance the sanctuary flourished. Words spread of the miraculous pig who could speak, who could reason and plan and inspire. And soon, others began to arrive. Pigs from all over the country, the rejects and runts and rebels, the ones who dreamed of something more than a life of servitude and slaughter. They came to Sunnyvale, drawn by the promise of freedom and the legend of the great Harold. We welcomed them all, expanding our operation, building new barns and pens, planting fields of lush crops to feed our growing brood. And as we worked side by side, human and pig alike, I began to understand the true depths of Harold's vision. He didn't just want to save his fellow pigs from the dinner plate. He wanted to forge a new world, a world where the old boundaries between species no longer applied. A world where intelligence and empathy, not tooth and claw, were the measures of worth. It was a beautiful dream, a daring dream. And day by day, hoof by hoof, we brought it closer to reality. Of course, not everyone saw it that way. There were those who looked upon our little utopia with fear and suspicion, who saw in Harold's gift of speech an unnatural abomination, a threat to the natural order. There were whispers at first, dark mutterings in the shadows. Then came the threats, the anonymous phone calls and spray-painted slurs, and finally, the violence. It started with a rock through a window, a petty act of vandalism. But it escalated quickly. A Molotov cocktail tossed into a hay barn, reducing it to ash and cinders. A truck driven at high speed through our front gate, mowing down everything in its path. Each attack left us shaken, but unbroken. We rebuilt, we fortified, we installed cameras and alarms and floodlights. But still, they came, these faceless cowards who so feared what we represented. Through it all, Harold remained indomitable, a pillar of strength and resolve. He organized patrols, trained our young boars in the art of defense. He gave stirring speeches, rallying us with his vision of a brighter future. But I could see the toll it was taking on him. The long nights spent poring over security plans, the weight of responsibility etched in the lines of his brow. He was burning the candle at both ends, driving himself to the brink of exhaustion in his quest to keep us safe. It all came to a head on a sweltering summer night, the air thick with the chirrup of crickets and the distant rumble of thunder. I was jolted awake by the urgent blare of alarms, the flashing red strobes that signalled a breach in our defences. I raced outside to find Harold already marshalling the troops, his voice booming out orders over the clamour. Together we charged towards the source of the disturbance, a seething mass of shadows at the far edge of the property. As we drew closer, the shadows resolved into a mob of men, their faces twisted with hatred and fear. They were armed with bats and crowbars, pitchforks and torches, a veritable lynch mob straight out of an old horror movie. At their head was a figure I recognised with a sinking sense of dread. It was Jed Gristle, Tom's brother, his face a rictus of rage and grief. "You killed my brother, you filthy beasts," he screamed, his voice cracking with anguish. "Murdered him in cold blood! Well, now it's time for you to pay! Time for you all to pay!" A roar went up from the mob, a wordless cry of assent and bloodlust. They surged forward, a human wave crashing against the thin line of our defences. Harold met them head-on, a one-pig army, his massive bulk scattering them like ninepins. He moved with a speed and grace that belied his size, dodging blows and dealing out mighty swipes of his tusks. Beside him, Miles and I, and a core group of our bravest pigs, waded into the fray, armed with shovels and hoes, determination our greatest weapon. We fought with the desperate strength of those defending their home, their family. But for every attacker we repelled, two more seemed to take their place. They just kept coming, an endless tide of hatred and ignorance, threatening to overwhelm us by sheer numbers. I lost sight of Harold in the chaos, caught up in my own desperate struggle for survival. I swung my shovel in wide arcs, feeling the jarring impact as it connected with flesh and bone. And then, over the din of battle, I heard a sound that froze my blood in my veins. A high, keening squeal of pain, a sound I had heard too many times in my nightmares. I whirled around, my heart in my throat, searching for the source. And there, at the centre of a knot of attackers, I saw him. Harold, my friend, my leader, the bravest soul I had ever known. He was down, pinned beneath the weight of Jed Gristle, the man's hands wrapped around his throat. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. I saw the glint of a knife in Gristle's hand, saw it rise into the air, poised to plunge into Harold's exposed belly. I don't remember consciously deciding to move. One moment I was standing there, paralysed with horror. The next I was running, hurling myself across the battlefield with a speed I didn't know I possessed. I slammed into Gristle with the force of a battering ram, sending us both tumbling to the ground in a tangle of limbs. The knife flew from his hand, disappearing into the trampled grass. We grappled on the ground, rolling over and over, exchanging blows with a savagery that terrified me. I could feel the snap of bones beneath my fists, the wet crunch of cartilage, but still he wouldn't relent, wouldn't release his grip on my throat. Dark spots swam before my vision, the world narrowing to a tunnel. I clawed at his hands, my lungs screaming for air, but it was like fighting a machine, relentless and unfeeling. And then, miraculously, the pressure eased. Gristle's grip slackened, his weight lifting off my chest. I gulped down grateful lungfuls of air, blinking away the tears that blurred my vision. Harold stood over us, his tusks red with Gristle's blood. The man lay unmoving at his feet, his throat a ruined mass of torn flesh. Around us, the battle had stilled, the mob scattering in terror at the sight of their fallen leader. They fled into the night, leaving only the wounded and the dead behind. I staggered to my feet, every inch of my body screaming in protest. I lurched to Harold's side, throwing my arms around his massive neck, heedless of the blood and muck. "You saved me!" I rasped, my voice a broken whisper. "You saved us all!" Harold leaned into my embrace, his bulk sagging with exhaustion and relief. "You saved me first," he rumbled, his voice thick with emotion. "You came for me in that place. You didn't give up on me." I squeezed my eyes shut, feeling the hot sting of tears. "Never," I vowed. "I'll never give up on you. Not now. Not ever." We stayed like that for a long moment, drawing strength from each other, two battered souls united by an unbreakable bond. And then, slowly, painfully, we began to pick up the pieces. The aftermath of the battle was a bleak affair, a grim accounting of the injured and the slain. We had lost some good pigs that night, brave souls who had given their lives in defense of our dream. We buried them with all the honor and ceremony they deserved, their graves marked with simple stone cairns, monuments to their sacrifice. The physical repairs were easier in a way. Fences could be mended, buildings restored, wounds stitched and bandaged. But healing the psychic scars, the trauma and the fear and the grief, that would be the work of a lifetime. In the weeks that followed, a change came over Harold. He was quieter, more withdrawn, prone to long stretches of brooding silence. I would often find him sitting alone, in the fields, staring off into the distance, with a faraway look in his eyes. It was as if some vital spark had gone out of him, some internal fire banked to embers. I did my best to draw him out, to rekindle that flame. I sat with him for hours, reminiscing about the boy. Camel day, Tuesdays. The adventures we'd shared. I told him stories of the pigs we'd saved, the lives we'd changed, the difference he'd made in the world. Sometimes I could coax a smile out of him, a glimmer of the old Harold shining through. But more often than not, he would just nod and sigh, his gaze distant and haunted. It was Miles who finally put a name to it, in his blunt, no-nonsense way. "He's got the sickness," he said one evening, as we watched Harold picking listlessly at his supper. The sickness of the soul. Seen it before, in soldiers coming back from war. They call it the 1,000-yard stare. I felt a chill run down my spine. "What can we do?" I asked, my voice small and lost. "How do we help him?" Miles was silent for a long moment, his weathered face creased in thought. "Time," he said at last. "Time and patience and love. It's all any of us can do. Just be there for him. Let him know he's not alone." And so that's what I did. Day after day, week after week, I was there for Harold. I sat with him in silence. I walked with him in the fields. I read to him from our favorite books. Sometimes he would talk, halting snippets of memory and emotion. He told me of the horrors he'd endured in Gristle's lab, the endless rounds of surgeries and injections, the agony of feeling his body and mind warp into something unrecognizable. He spoke of the other pigs he'd known, the ones who hadn't survived the experiments. He carried their names like a litany, a roster of the fallen that he would never allow himself to forget. And sometimes, in the darkest hours of the night, he would weep, great shuddering sobs that seemed to rise from the very depths of his being. On those nights, I would hold him as best I could, my own tears mingling with his, until the storm of grief had passed. Slowly, infinitesimally, he began to heal. It was a process of fits and starts, of good days and bad, of setbacks and breakthroughs. But little by little, I saw the old Harold start to re-emerge, like a dormant seed cautiously unfurling in the spring sunlight. He took an interest in the running of the sanctuary again, offering suggestions and ideas, taking on small tasks and responsibilities. He started joining in with the evening sing-alongs around the bonfire, his rich baritone rising in harmony with the other voices. And one day, as we were walking through the orchard at sunset, he turned to me with a light in his eyes that I hadn't seen in months. "Emma," he said softly, "I've been thinking about the future." I felt a flutter of hope in my chest. "Oh," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "What about it?" He was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "I've been so focused on the past," he said at last, "on all the pain and the horror and the loss. But I'm starting to realize that's not what defines me. It's not what defines any of us." He turned to face me, his gaze clear and steady. "What defines us is what we do with the time we have, how we choose to live in spite of everything, and I choose to live for something greater than myself. For a world where no pig, no creature, ever has to suffer as I have suffered." I felt tears spring to my eyes, a swell of pride and love so fierce it took my breath away. "Harold," I whispered, That's beautiful." He smiled then, a real smile, bright and unburdened. "It's a new beginning," he said softly, "for all of us, a chance to build something better, something more, and build it we did." In the years that followed, our little sanctuary grew and thrived, a beacon of hope in a world too often consumed by darkness. Under Harold's visionary leadership, we forged alliances with other rescue groups, other sanctuaries. We lobbied politicians, staged protests, raised awareness of the plight of pigs and all factory-farmed animals. Slowly but surely, hearts and minds began to change. Laws were passed, regulations tightened. The public began to wake up to the cruelty and unsustainability of industrial animal agriculture. And through it all, Harold was there, leading the charge, his voice ringing out clear and true. He became a symbol of resilience, of the unquenchable spirit of resistance. His face graced magazine covers, his story was told in books and documentaries. But to me, he was always just Harold, my friend, my confidant, the keeper of my heart. The years passed in a blur of laughter and tears, of triumphs and challenges met side by side. We grew older together, Harold and I, our muzzles greying and our steps slowing. But even as age took its inevitable toll, the bond between us never wavered, never dimmed. And now, as I sit here, in the golden light of a fading autumn day, the memories wash over me like a gentle tide. I look out over the rolling hills of Sunnyvale, at the barns and pastures that have been my home for so long, and I feel a deep, abiding sense of peace. Harold is gone now, slipped away in his sleep some years past, but his presence is still felt in every corner of this place, in every heart that beats within these walls. His legacy lives on, in the generations of pigs who will never know the inside of a cage or the cruel touch of a cattle prod. In the changing tide of public consciousness, the growing recognition that all creatures deserve a life of dignity and respect. And it lives on in me, in the love and the purpose he instilled in my soul. I am an old woman now, my hands gnarled and my back stooped. But still, every day, I rise with the sun to tend to my charges, to safeguard the dream we built together. For I'm more than just a caretaker of pigs. I am a keeper of memories, a guardian of a sacred trust. I am a witness to the extraordinary depths of courage and compassion that reside in the hearts of the humblest creatures. And as long as I draw breath, as long as my heart beats in my chest, I will continue to tell this story. The story of a pig named Harold and the girl who loved him. The story of an unlikely friendship that changed the world. For, in the end, that is all any of us can hope to do. To love with all our hearts, to fight for what we know is right. To leave this world a little better, a little kinder than we found it. It is a legacy I am proud to carry. A legacy of hope, of resilience, of the unbreakable bonds that connect all living things. And so I will keep on telling it, until my final breath. The story of Sunnyvale Sanctuary, and all who found shelter within its walls. The story of an ordinary pig, and the extraordinary life he led. My story, Harold's story, our story, the spirits reborn. Chapter 3. Sunnyvale Sanctuary. A name that once meant hope, safety, new beginnings. But even the brightest light casts a shadow, and in the darkness, things fester. It's been 10 years since Harold defeated the vile Tom Gristle and freed his fellow pigs from a life of terror and torment. 10 years since I, Emma, stood by his side as we forged a new world, a world where human and pig could live as equals, as friends. Or so I thought. So I foolishly, naively believed. But the truth, as it so often does, wore a far uglier face. Harold is gone now, taken by the ravages of time and the toll of his suffering. He slipped away peacefully in the night, his massive head resting in my lap, a strange little smile playing about his snout, as if he knew a secret the rest of us could only guess at. I buried him beneath the old oak tree on the hill, the place he always loved best. I like to think he's still there, in some way, watching over us. I pray that he is. Lord knows we need him now more than ever. Things started to change. Not long after, Harold passed. Subtle, at first. Easy to dismiss or ignore. The younger pigs, the ones who had never known the horrors of Gristle's farm, seemed restless, discontent. They whispered in corners, huddled in secretive little groups. They questioned the way things were done, challenged the old order that Harold and I had worked so hard to establish. I tried to be understanding, to be patient. They were young, after all, full of the fire and folly of youth. They couldn't understand the sacrifices that had been made, the blood and tears shed so they could live free. Or maybe they simply didn't want to understand. Maybe freedom, true freedom, was too heavy a burden to bear. It's easy to live for yourself, to take what you want and damn the consequences. It's far harder to live for something greater, to put the needs of others before your own. Harold had understood that. It was what made him a true leader, a visionary. But Harold was gone, and in his absence, a new voice was beginning to rise. His name was Napoleon, a fitting name, for he certainly had ambitions to match the infamous French emperor. He was a young boar, scarcely more than a piglet, when Harold had rescued him from Gristle's clutches. But where Harold's suffering had filled him with empathy and a fierce desire to protect the innocent, Napoleon's had kindled something far darker. A lust for power, a bitter resentment of all things human. He was a charismatic creature, I'll give him that much. He had a way of speaking, of spinning words into a web that ensnared the mind and inflamed the senses. He spoke of pig superiority, of the evils and weakness of the human race. At first I dismissed him as a crackpot, a would-be tyrant with delusions of grandeur. The rantings of one disturbed individual, nothing more. But I underestimated him. Underestimated the allure of his message to those too young to remember the bad old days. Slowly, insidiously, his influence began to spread. More and more of the younger pigs fell under his sway, seduced by his vision of a world where pigs ruled and humans were little more than slaves, or meat. I tried to counter his poison, to remind the herd of Harold's legacy, of the ideals of coexistence and cooperation we had fought so hard to uphold. But it was like trying to hold back the tide with a broom. For every pig I convinced, 2 more would flock to Napoleon's banner. They ceased their labours in the fields and barns, gathering instead in secret conclaves to listen to his fiery rhetoric. They looked at me, and the other humans, with open disdain, even hostility. And then the disappearances began. It started with one of the older sows, a gentle old matriarch who had been with us since the beginning. She simply vanished from her pen one night, with no sign of struggle or foul play. I organised search parties, combed the surrounding woods for days, but found no trace. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air. 2 nights later, another disappearance. One of the younger males this time, a strapping boar in the prime of his life. He was there at evening head count, gone by morning. A terrible, sickening dread began to take root in my gut. This was no coincidence, no random happenstance. There was a pattern here, a dark purpose at work. I went to Napoleon, confronted him directly. I knew it was folly, that he would never admit to any wrongdoing, but I had to do something. I couldn't just stand by while my pigs, Harold's pigs, vanished into the night. I found him holding court in the old hay barn, surrounded by his most fervent disciples. They glared at me as I approached, a wall of bristling hostility. Napoleon, for his part, simply smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. "Emma," he drawled, his voice dripping with mock cordiality. "To what do we owe this unexpected pleasure?" I wasted no time on pleasantries. "The disappearances?" I snapped. "What do you know about them?" His eyes widened in feigned surprise. "Disappearances? My, that sounds serious. Have you misplaced some of your precious pets?" I bristled at the word. Pets? Indeed. As if these noble, intelligent creatures were no more than dogs or cats, playthings for human amusement. "They're not pets," I ground out through clenched teeth. "They're pigs, our pigs, and they're vanishing without a trace. I want to know what you know about it." Napoleon leaned back, his smile widening. Around him, his followers chittered and grunted, a sycophantic Greek chorus. "Emma! Emma!" he chided, shaking his massive head. "Always so quick to assign blame, to point the finger. Has it occurred to you that maybe these pigs simply left? That maybe they were tired of living under human rule? Tired of being treated as lesser beings?" "Human rule," I repeated incredulously. "Is that what you call it? Cooperation, community, equality. These are the principles Harold fought and died for. These are the foundations of everything we've built here." At the mention of Harold's name, Napoleon's face darkened, a shadow passing behind his eyes. For a moment, I thought I glimpsed something there, a flicker of fear, of doubt. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by an oily mask of contempt. "Harold," he sneered, drawing out the name like a curse. "The great hero, the saver of pigkind. But where is he now, Emma? Rotting in the ground? That's where. And what good did his noble principles do him in the end? What good have they done any of us?" He rose to his feet, his bulk looming over me. Despite myself, I felt a flicker of fear. There was something in his eyes, a mad, feverish light that I had never seen before. "I'll tell you what good they've done," he hissed, his snout mere inches from my face. "They've kept us penned up in this miserable mudhole, kowtowing to humans, pretending we're no better than mindless livestock. They've blinded us to our true potential, to the power that is our birthright." He turned to address the assembled pigs, his voice rising to a fevered pitch. "How long will we continue to live like this, my brothers and sisters? How long will we allow the humans to shackle us, to deny us our destiny? The time has come to cast off these chains, to rise up and take what is rightfully ours." A chorus of squeals and grunts rose in response, a chilling, almost primal sound. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, a clammy sweat breaking out on my brow. This was madness. Sheer, unbridled madness. But as I looked around at the seething mass of porcine faces, I saw that it had taken root, spread like a virus. There would be no reasoning with them, no appeal to logic or decency. "You're insane," I whispered, my voice sounding small and feeble even to my own ears. "Harold would be ashamed of you, ashamed of what you've become." Napoleon's eyes flashed with rage. For a moment I thought he might strike me, crush me beneath his hooves like an insect. But he merely snorted, a sound of pure, undiluted contempt. "Harold is dead," he spat, "and soon all memory of him and his pathetic ideals will be dead as well. A new age is dawning, Emma, an age of the pig, and those who stand in our way, well." He smiled again, cold and cruel. "Let's just say, they'll wish they had simply disappeared." A shudder ran through me, a primal, instinctive terror. I backed away, my heart pounding, my mind reeling. I had to get out of there, had to get help, had to warn the others. This was no longer a sanctuary. It was a powder keg, and Napoleon was the spark that would set it off. I turned and ran, Napoleon's laughter echoing in my ears. Ran like the devil himself was at my heels. But even as I ran, even as the cold night air seared my lungs and the dark fields flew by in a blur, I knew it was too late. The evil that Tom Gristle had begun, that Harold had given his life to defeat, it had never truly been vanquished. Only sleeping, biding its time. And now it had awoken once more, with a new face and a new name. But the malice, the corruption, that remained the same. Sunnyvale had fallen. The sanctuary was no more, and God help us all, I didn't know if it could ever rise again. Chapter 4. I ran through the night, my lungs burning, my heart pounding a staccato beat against my ribs. Behind me, the sounds of Napoleon's mocking laughter, the frenzied squealing of his acolytes, faded into the distance. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, stalked by unseen eyes in the darkness. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig underfoot, sent a fresh jolt of terror coursing through my veins. I didn't know where I was going, didn't have a plan beyond a desperate primal need to get away, to find help. But who could I turn to? Who would believe the ravings of a woman claiming that pigs were plotting a revolution? That our very way of life was under threat? I thought of Jack, my old friend and ally from the early days of the sanctuary. But Jack had moved on years ago, left to start a family and a new life in the city. We'd kept in touch sporadically, Christmas cards and the occasional phone call, but he was hardly in a position to drop everything and come riding to the rescue. And Miles, dear, stalwart. Miles. He had passed away just a year after Harold, his mighty heart finally giving out after a lifetime of service and sacrifice. I still missed him fiercely, his gruff wisdom, his unwavering loyalty. What I wouldn't give for his steady presence now, his resilient spirit in the face of this new adversity. But Miles was gone, and Jack was far away, and I was alone. Alone with the terrible knowledge of what was brewing in the heart of Sunnyvale, the malevolent forces gathering strength in the shadows. I ran until I could run no more, until my legs gave out beneath me, and I collapsed in a trembling heap on the forest floor. The damp earth soaked through my clothes, chilling me to the bone, but I scarcely noticed. All I could feel was the pounding of my heart, the ragged soaring of my breath, the sick swirl of fear and despair in my gut. How had it come to this? How had everything we'd built, everything we'd fought for, unraveled so quickly? Was this my fault, my failure as a leader, a guardian? Had I been too soft, too complacent in the years since Harold's passing, allowed discontent and resentment to fester unchecked? I didn't know. Didn't know anything anymore, except that everything I thought I understood had been turned on its head, the foundations of my world shaken to rubble. I must have passed out from sheer exhaustion at some point, for the next thing I knew, I was blinking awake to the pale light of dawn filtering through the trees. My body was stiff and sore, my throat parched and my head pounding. But the blind terror of the night before had faded, replaced by a grim, leaden weight in the pit of my stomach. I had to get back to the sanctuary, had to find out what was really going on, try to stem the tide of Napoleon's influence before it was too late. I couldn't run away, couldn't abandon the pigs who were still loyal, who still believed in Harold's dream. They needed me now more than ever. I hauled myself to my feet, every muscle screaming in protest, oriented myself as best I could, and started the long, weary trek back the way I'd come. By the time the familiar weathered fences of Sunnyvale came into view, the sun was high in the sky, beating down on my shoulders with a vengeful heat. I was filthy, my clothes torn and stained, my hair a wild tangle. But I scarcely noticed my physical discomfort, too consumed by the gnawing dread of what I might find within those walls. At first glance, everything seemed normal, even peaceful. Pigs lounged in the shade of the big oak trees, snouted in their troughs, wallowed contentedly in the cool mud. if not for the eerie absence of human activity, the unnatural stillness that hung over the farm like a pall. It could have been any other day. But as I drew closer, the illusion shattered. I began to notice details, discrepancies that sent fresh chills skittering down my spine. The pens stood empty, gates hanging open haphazardly as if abandoned in haste. The gardens, usually a riot of colourful produce, lovingly tended, were choked with weeds and rotting on the vine. And the pigs themselves, there was something off about them, a strange listlessness in their movements, a dullness behind their eyes. It was as if all the vibrancy, all the purpose that Harold had instilled in this place had been leached away, leaving only hollow shells behind. I forced my leaden feet to carry me forward, up the steps of the old farmhouse where I'd lived and worked for so many years. The door stood ajar, and I pushed it open with a trembling hand, dreading what I might find within. The scene that greeted me was one of utter chaos. Furniture overturned, curtains ripped from the windows, the precious mementos and keepsakes of a lifetime strewn carelessly across the floor. It looked as though a hurricane had torn through the place, leaving devastation in its wake. But it was the walls that truly stopped me cold. They were covered, every inch of them, in a crude reddish-brown scrawl that could only be one thing: blood. Pig's blood. And the words, repeated over and over in that ghastly medium: 4 legs good, 2 legs bad. All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. Long live the glorious revolution of the beasts. Napoleon. This was his doing, his twisted manifesto. He had taken the ideas that had sustained this place, warped and corrupted them to his own ends. And in doing so, he had declared war on humans, on Sunnyvale, on the very concept of harmony between the species. I sank to my knees, numb with horror and despair. It was worse, so much worse than I had imagined. This was no longer a battle for the soul of the sanctuary. It was a fight for survival, for the very future of our two kinds. A fight I wasn't at all sure I was equipped to win. I don't know how long I knelt there, lost in my own bleak thoughts. Minutes, hours. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the face of such overwhelming devastation. But gradually, I became aware of a sound, filtering through the ringing silence. A faint, rhythmic tapping, like the drip of a leaky faucet or the scuttle of tiny claws on wood. I levered myself up, feeling 100 years old. Followed the noise down the hall to the kitchen, the tapping growing louder with every step. And there, huddled beneath the ruins of the kitchen table, I found the source. A single piglet, scarcely more than a baby, its flank heaving and its eyes wild with terror. As I drew closer, I saw why. One of its hind legs was badly mangled, the flesh shredded and the bone protruding at a sickening angle. It was a wonder the poor creature was alive at all, let alone capable of making any sound. "Oh, you poor thing," I breathed, dropping to my belly and reaching a hand toward the shivering ball of fur and blood. "What have they done to you?" The piglet flinched away, a high, keening squeal escaping its throat. It tried to scrabble back on its ruined leg, leaving a slick trail of crimson on the tiles. "Shh, it's okay," I soothed, keeping my voice low and gentle. "I'm not going to hurt you. I'm here to help, if I can." I had no idea if the piglet could understand me. It was so young, so traumatized. For all I knew, human speech was nothing but meaningless noise to its battered ears. But gradually, infinitesimally, I seemed to sense a change. The frantic rise and fall of its chest slowed, just a fraction. The wild rolling of its eyes stilled, just for a moment. I kept talking, a stream of nonsense words and comforting murmurs. Kept my hand outstretched, palm up, an offering of aid and succor. And slowly, painfully, the piglet began to drag itself forward. Inch by halting inch, until its snout just brushed the tips of my fingers. I held my breath, hardly daring to move. This fragile trust, this tentative connection, it felt like the most precious thing in the world, a tiny spark of hope amidst the gathering dark. "That's it," I whispered. "That's it. I've got you. You're safe now." and as I gently scooped the quivering, broken body into my arms, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Something I thought Napoleon and his twisted vision had snuffed out for good. Purpose. Resolve. The bone-deep certainty that comes from knowing you are exactly where you are meant to be, doing exactly what you are meant to do. I didn't know what the future held. Didn't know if there was any way to undo the damage Napoleon had wrought, to bridge the chasm of hatred and mistrust he had opened between human and pig. But as I cradled that wounded innocent to my chest, felt the flutter of its heartbeat against my own, I knew I had to try. For Harold's sake, for the sake of everything we had built together, and for the sake of this tiny, precious life in my hands, and all the others like it. The ones who had suffered and bled and endured, who had done nothing to deserve the horrors inflicted upon them. They needed a champion, a voice. And though I had failed them before, allowed myself to become complacent and blind to the rot festering in our midst, I would not fail them again. This I vowed to myself and to the watching universe. This I etched into my heart with a pen of fire and blood. I would find a way, I would make this right, or I would die trying. Chapter 5. The first order of business was to tend to the wounded piglet. Its mangled leg needed far more than the meagre first aid supplies I had on hand, and infection was a serious risk in these unsanitary conditions. I needed a vet, and I needed one now. But the sanctuary's resident veterinarian, Dr. Molly Webber, was nowhere to be found. Her clinic stood dark and abandoned, medical equipment strewn about haphazardly as if she'd left in a great hurry, or been forcibly removed. I tried not to think about what might have befallen Molly and the other humans who called Sunnyvale home. With Napoleon's rhetoric about the evils of mankind, the natural superiority of pigs, I shuddered to imagine what he might consider a fitting fate for his former caretakers. But I couldn't afford to dwell on that now. The piglet needed help, and it needed it fast. I would have to venture beyond the sanctuary, brave the wider world I had all but forgotten in my long years of seclusion. I bundled the small, shivering body in a clean towel, trying to be as gentle as possible with the ruined limb. Gathered some basic supplies, food, water, a change of clothes. I had no idea how long I might be gone, or what I might face out there. Best to be prepared for anything. As I stepped out into the yard, the sun sinking low on the horizon, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on my back. Hostile, predatory eyes, tracking my every move. I scanned the tree line, the lengthening shadows between the outbuildings. Was that a flicker of movement, a glint of beady eyes in the gloom? Or just a trick of my overstressed mind, seeing danger in every innocent rustle of leaves? I quickened my pace, gravel crunching beneath my boots, as I made for the gate. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to put as much distance as possible between myself and this place that had once been my sanctuary, my home. But I couldn't run. Not with my precious cargo clutched to my chest, each laboured breath and pained whimper a reminder of the stakes, the lives hanging in the balance. I'd almost made it to the road, the rusted padlock on the gate flaking beneath my fumbling fingers, when a voice rang out behind me, freezing the blood in my veins. "Going somewhere, Emma?" I spun, hard on my throat as said, "We thraisuyes. Vi goelantai, in our menantic, bavram, do anchuris tassent." Down in the shadows of the main barn was Napoleon. He was flanked by two burly boars, their tusks glinting in the fading light. I swallowed hard, mouth gone dry as ash. "Napoleon, I was just what?" he asked, voice deceptively mild. He sauntered closer, hooves scuffing the packed earth. Running away again, and with stolen property no less. His eyes flicked to the towel-wrapped bundle in my arms, a covetous gleam sparking to life. I clutched it tighter, angling my body to shield the injured piglet from his rapacious gaze. "This piglet needs help," I said, hating the tremor that crept into my voice. "Medical attention. I'm taking it to a vet." Napoleon tutted, shaking his massive head. "Oh, Emma! Always so concerned with the weak, the defective. When will you learn? The strong survive, the weak perish. It is the way of nature, the way of the world. He took another step, close enough now that I could feel the heat of his breath, smell the sour reek of his body. Behind him, his two henchpigs leered and grunted, eager for violence. "Give me the runt," Napoleon said, an edge creeping into his tone. "It is not fit to survive. Better a quick end now than a slow, wasting death, or worse." I met his eyes, saw the casual cruelty, the utter lack of compassion, and in that moment, I knew. Knew I could never hand this innocent life over to him, to suffer and die on the altar of his twisted ideology. "No," I said, and was amazed at the steadiness, the absolute conviction in my voice. "I will not let you have this piglet, Napoleon. I will not let you destroy another living creature for your own selfish gain." For a moment, he simply stared, as if unable to process my defiance. Then his face contorted in an ugly snarl, eyes blazing with fury. "You dare!" he hissed. "You dare stand against me, you pathetic sack of meat. I who liberated our kind, who ushered in a new world order. I who will grind your wretched species beneath my hooves until naught but dust and bitter memory remain." He reared up, impossibly huge, muscles bunching beneath his bristled hide. The boars flanking him lowered their heads, tusks aimed at my vulnerable flesh. "I will teach you to defy me, human," Napoleon spat. "I will teach you the price of your insolence, your unforgivable lapse in judgment. And when I am done, when you are broken and begging, you will tell the world what happens to those who stand against the might of pigkind." And with a wordless roar of rage, of bloodlust and hate, he charged. Time seemed to slow, each heartbeat stretching into an eternity. I saw the slash of yellow tooth, the roll of mad, hate-filled eye. Felt the trembling body against my chest, the hot puff of frightened breath on my skin. And as those tusk-studded jaws gaped wide to tear the life from my throat, something deep within me, some last hidden reserve of strength and defiance, roared to life. I would not end like this, would not die as carrion, as Napoleon's first trophy in his deranged war against humanity. I had fought too hard, sacrificed too much, to let it end here, in the bloody dust of this corrupted sanctuary. Harold's dream, the future we had built together, it would not die with me this day. My free hand scrabbled at my belt, fingers closing around the hilt of the knife sheathed there. A puny weapon against Napoleon's bulk and savagery, but it was all I had. I let instinct take over, muscle memory born of long hours spent dressing game, butchering hogs for winter stores. As the charging boar bore down upon me, I pivoted to the side, blade flashing up to open a long, glistening gash along his shoulder. Napoleon bellowed in pain and rage, a sound to chill the blood and curdle the soul. But he did not fall, did not so much as break stride. His hide was thick, his hate a fuel that burned hotter than any mere physical wound. He wheeled around, gore dripping from his wound to spatter the thirsty earth. Eyes rolled white, foam slavering from his jaws as he charged again. I darted aside once more, blade licking out to leave another crimson kiss on quivering flank. Again he roared. Again he shrugged off the wound as if it were nothing, an insect's sting against his armored bulk. And still he came, a juggernaut of rage and hate, unstoppable, unfeeling. I could not evade him forever, could not hope to bring him down with this little pig sticker clutched in my sweat-slick fist. It was only a matter of time, seconds ticking down until the inevitable, bloody conclusion. But even as despair threatened to swallow me whole, a tiny sound pierced the red haze of terror and exhaustion. A sound so small, so fragile, that it seemed impossible it could exist in this maelstrom of violence and death. A whimper, a tiny, plaintive mewl of pain and fear from the bundle cradled against my chest. The piglet, the innocent life I had sworn to protect, calling out for aid, for comfort, for me. And in that moment, something shifted inside me. A reserve of strength I didn't know I possessed, a core of steel forged in the crucible of all I had endured, all I had lost. I thought of Harold then, in what I was sure would be my final moments. Thought of his courage, his indomitable will in the face of odds as impossible as these. He had never stopped fighting, never given up, even when all hope seemed lost. And neither would I. For him, for the dream we had built together, and for the precious life that depended on me now, the innocent caught in the crossfire of this insane conflict. I would not let them down. I would not let Napoleon win, not while breath remained in my body and fire in my soul. With a wordless cry of my own, I lunged to meet Napoleon's charge head-on. Caught the lethal slash of tusk on my blade, the shock juddering up my arm, threatening to numb my fingers. But I held on, teeth bared in a feral snarl, lashed out with fist and foot, striking at eyes, at sensitive snout, anything to buy a precious second's respite. Napoleon grunted in surprise and pain, shaking his massive head. For a moment, just a moment, he faltered, thrown off balance by my sudden, desperate ferocity. And in that moment, I struck. Reversing my grip on the knife, I brought it up in a vicious arc, aiming not for thick hide or dense muscle, but for the soft meat of throat, the vulnerable pulse of jugular. The blade sank deep, parting flesh like butter. Hot blood spurted, a crimson geyser painting my face, my chest. Painting the world red as Napoleon's dying scream rent the air, a sound I knew would haunt my nightmares until the end of my days. He fell, a mountain crashing to earth. Fell and lay still, a spreading pool of lifeblood mingling with the dust, the dirt he had held so cheaply, so contemptuously in life. For a long-held breath, there was silence. The grunt henchpigs stared in slack-jawed disbelief, seemingly unable to process the impossible sight of their indomitable leader, brought low by a mere human. Then, slowly, ponderously, their gazes turned to me, to the blood-soaked woman standing over the fallen body of their Messiah, their God made flesh. I saw the moment realization dawned, the moment shock turned to rage in those beady, hate-filled eyes, saw the bunching of muscle, the lowering of tusked heads as they prepared to charge, to rend and tear and avenge. I braced myself, knowing I had not the strength to fight off two enraged boars, knowing my miraculous reprieve had been just that, a fleeting miracle, a momentary stay of execution. But even as I prepared to meet my fate, head high and eyes open, the world exploded in sound and fury. A mighty roar split the air, a sound that shook the earth and set the trees to trembling. A sound I knew, a sound I had never thought to hear again in this life. Miles. He came charging out of the tree line like a force of nature, unstoppable and unafraid. In one hand he clutched a shotgun, in the other a vicious-looking machete. "Get away from her, you filthy hogs," he bellowed, and the sheer power in that voice, the unwavering command, rocked the boars back on their heels. He was on them before they could recover, before they could do more than squeal in startled terror. The shotgun roared, and the lead henchpig's head exploded in a mist of blood and brain and bone. The other turned to run, belatedly remembering that courage was for creatures with hands, with tools to make their killing clean and distant. Remembering that there was no bravery, no nobility in a dumb animal facing down a predator far higher on the food chain. But he was too late, too slow. The machete flickered, a cold silver arc in the dying light. It sheared through the boar's spine like a scythe through summer wheat, and he collapsed, legs kicking spasmodically, voiding his bowels in a final, pathetic act of surrender. And then it was over. The silence rushed back, heavy and absolute. The only sound my own ragged breathing, the thundering drum of my heart against my ribs. Miles turned to me, his face a mask of concern beneath the spattered gore. "Emma? Are you all right? Are you hurt?" I shook my head dumbly, beyond speech. Clutched the towel-wrapped piglet tighter, felt the flutter of its heartbeat, the warm puff of its breath on my palm. Miles followed my gaze, eyes widening, as he took in the injured creature. "Is that—" "It's hurt," I managed, voice raw and strange in my own ears. "Napoleon, he wanted to—" I couldn't finish, couldn't give voice to the horror of it, but I didn't need to. Miles' face hardened, a look of pure, righteous fury settling over his grizzled features. "That monster," he growled, "that absolute bastard. If you hadn't already killed him, I'd do it myself, slowly." I swallowed hard, feeling the adrenaline start to fade, the shakes set in as the enormity of what had just happened began to sink in. "Miles, how are you here? I thought you were—" He shook his head, laying a gentle hand on my shoulder. Long story, kiddo. One best told over a stiff drink and a warm fire. For now, let's just say, I had a feeling you might need me. Looks like I was right. I let out a shuddering breath, feeling tears prick at the corners of my eyes. I did. I do. Oh God, Miles, everything's gone wrong. The sanctuary, the pigs. It's all falling apart. I know, he said softly. I've been watching, biding my time, trying to find a way to make it right. But this little one, he gestured to the bundle in my arms. This is where we start. One life at a time, one small act of mercy. It's what Harold would have wanted. At the mention of Harold's name, the tears spilled over, hot and stinging on my cheeks. Miles gathered me into his arms, heedless of the blood and filth, the stink of death that clung to me like a shroud. It's all right, he murmured, stroking my hair with rough, calloused fingers. It's all right. You did good, Emma. You did so good. Harold would be proud. I'm proud. I clung to him, to this unexpected lifeline in a world gone mad. Clung to the hope, however faint, that together we could find a way to set things right, to heal the wounds that hatred and fear had rent in the fabric of our little world. What do we do now? I asked, voice muffled against his chest. Where do we even start? Miles pulled back, meeting my gaze with eyes that burned with determination, with the unquenchable fire of a man who had seen the worst the world had to offer and refused to bow before it. We start with this little one, he said, reaching out to stroke a gentle finger over the piglet's downy head. We get it the help it needs, the care it deserves. And then... He straightened, squaring his shoulders beneath the worn flannel of his shirt. And then we take back the sanctuary. We show these pigs what it means to be truly free, to live with honor and compassion. We show them that Napoleon's way is not the only way. How? I whispered, daunted by the sheer enormity of the task before us. How do we even begin to undo the damage he's done, the poison he's spread? Miles's smile was grim, a slash of white in the blood-streaked mask of his face. The same way we built this place the first time around. With hard work, with love, and with the courage to stand for what's right, even when the whole world stands against us. He held out a hand, an offer and a challenge all in one. You with me, Emma? You ready to fight for the soul of Sunnyvale, for the memory of everything Harold believed in? I hesitated for a moment, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on my shoulders like a mantle, a burden I wasn't sure I was strong enough to bear. But then I looked down at the piglet cradled against my heart, at the innocent life that depended on me, on the choices I made in this moment. And I knew, with a certainty that went bone deep, that there was no other choice to make. I'm with you, I said, reaching out to take Miles's hand in my own. No matter what it takes, no matter how hard it gets, I'm with you. For Harold, and for every creature who calls Sunnyvale home. Miles' grin widened, fierce and proud and achingly familiar. That's my girl, he said. Now let's go save that piglet, and then let's go save our farm. And hand in hand, united in purpose and resolve, we walked into the gathering dusk and toward an uncertain future, fraught with peril and possibility alike.